Delighted to be here today. Yeah, I'm one of two assistant heads of division for building standards. Within my portfolio, I have Section 3, Section 4, Section 5, and Section 6 of the building regulations. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with those, that's environment, safety, noise, and energy. Also have responsibility for the research budget. I've also got regained responsibility for energy performance of buildings directive implementation. I managed to get a year off for good behavior. And also responsible for the Section 63 of the Climate Change, Climate Change Scotland Act. I'm going to try and stick to the 20 minutes, but I actually designed this presentation for 30 minutes, so I might go over a wee bit. Right, first of all, what I'd like to speak to you about is the current Section 6. We'll just touch briefly on that. Then I'm going to go into a wee bit more depth on the changes that are proposed for 2010, October of this year. Then moving on to what we have in terms of sustainability standards in building regs, and then a possible Section 7. We've got 6 sections at the moment, but we may have a section on sustainability labelling. Okay, 3 years ago, we introduced revised energy standards. One of the main drivers was meeting the manifesto commitment of the political leaders at that time. The other driver was making sure we were compliant with the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, making sure that we adopted a methodology, and we also set our regulations for energy standards through that methodology. So the current energy standards, they deliver at the moment between an 18 and 25% reduction in CO2 emissions, and that's when compared with 2002, and that's for new dwellings. For new non-domestic buildings, we get a 23 to 28% reduction on 2002. But I think to put things in context, we heard about baselines earlier, and it's important to have a look at where are we measuring this from? Well, really, overall, a building that was built today to the standards that exist would be around 60% more efficient in terms of CO2 emissions than one that was built to the building regulations that existed in 1990. And I'll just say at this stage, what we cover is effectively the built form and the services that go into the building. I do like the way that Jonathan Fair describes it. Jonathan Fair's of Homes from Scotland. He says, if you take the building, turn it upside down, give it a shake, building regulations deal with the stuff that wouldn't fall out. Okay, around 3 years ago, we got a new administration, an SNP administration, and they also had manifesto commitments. And one of those was to have form an expert panel to work out what they needed to do to the building regulations, the energy standards. And we did actually form the expert panel. The expert panel met in September 2007. It was chaired by Lynn Sullivan, sustainability architect, worked for Broadway Malyon at that time. And the panel's deliberations were reported by Christmas of 2007. And amongst other things, there were recommendations for staged improvements to energy standards for 2010, for 2013, and the aspiration of zero carbon for 2016, 2017. Our Minister, Stuart Stevenson, is Minister for Transport, Infrastructure and Climate Change. He made the announcement on what was going to be achieved last year in February. We consulted in the summer of last year. That was a detailed technical consultation. And the last bullet point on this slide is really just a reminder that we have some incredibly tough targets in terms of CO2 reductions, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, in regard to the Climate Change Scotland Act. Okay, over the next few slides I'm going to be talking about these points, but the one thing I think I will maybe mention at this stage, because it doesn't really feature anywhere else in my presentation, is the last bullet point there, which is we have actually introduced a mechanism which should encourage the improvement of existing buildings. Certainly for dwellings, when dwellings are extended, regard is given to the energy efficiency, or should I say the fabric, the level of U value of the fabric of the existing dwelling. So if you have a reasonable standard of roof insulation and wall insulation in the existing dwelling, then you get to build to a slightly lesser standard for your extension. But if you have a poor standard of insulation in your existing building, you have to try a bit harder in the extension. And we've also got another mechanism for non-domestic buildings, which is requiring the building owners, when they elect to do work on certain aspects of the building, which is focusing on the services, they have to consider doing more to the rest of the building services. So, for example, if they're doing a bit of lighting work, they would have to consider upgrading the lighting controls. Okay, a bit more detail. We've still retained the fuel package table. Now that's and I'll give the next slide actually shows what that looks like. It's proved to be popular because although it sets the target that needs to be met in terms of the CO2 emissions for new dwellings, it also gives a quasi-elemental approach. We're getting a 30% reduction. That's what the Minister announced. But it's an aggregate for dwellings. To put things in perspective, biomass house would maybe have to do a reduction of about 27% compared with the current standards. A gas boiler heated house would do a 30% reduction, but electrically heated house would have to do a 34% reduction. But across the piece, we get the 30% reduction. We've raised the fabric and infiltration standards as far as that's concerned, and we've also introduced some additional parameters. We've introduced thermal mass, mainly because SAP 2009, that's the methodology we use for dwellings, actually takes account of thermal mass. But we don't want to penalize different building types or construction types. So we've actually, although we've introduced it, we've actually negated the effect of that. The notional building, if your actual building is going to be timber frame, your notional building would also be timber frame. If your actual building was of cavity block construction, your notional building would be of cavity block construction. Very important thing that we've taken account of is the thermal bypass side of things as far as separating walls are concerned. For years, building regulations have said, oh, heat loss through party walls, you just disregard them. There's little or no heat loss. There was research that was carried out down south. I think it was at Stamford Brook. Leeds Metropolitan did work there. And they found that a cavity separating wall actually acted like a flue. And actually, there was a lot of heat that was actually lost through convection currents. So we now take account of that. And we've also got, in the fuel package table, a low carbon equipment element.